What's up, everyone, and welcome to Clear Talk. So, in this one, we are going back into religion. All right. I know that there's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now. A lot of political issues and things that people are trying to think through and grasp and whatnot. But from time to time, I do like to talk about other things, and I've got a really good series. I think, anyways, I feel like a pretty good series going on here in religion, and uh, so this is the next video in that series, and we're going to start. This is the first part for Jesus. Okay, I've decided that I'm going to divide it up into different parts. When I originally thought this through, I've did one video for so far. I've did one video for Satan, one video for hell, one video for heaven, one video for God. But when it comes to Jesus, I felt like there was a lot more to talk about. I mean, you know, uh, Christianity for one is pretty much, or at least is supposed to be wrapped in the idea of Jesus, and his teachings and all that good stuff. So, I wanted to, uh, I've decided that I wanted to go a little bit deeper with the videos that that talk about that. So what I'm going to do, and at first when I thought this through, I had decided that I was going to do like I was going to split it into two. This and what I was going to do is I was going to do like the birth narrative before Christmas. That was my intention, um, and I even like attempted to do it like twice, and things just weren't flowing right for me, and so I just nixed it and was like, you know what, I'm not in the right headspace, and so I'm going to wait until later on at some point I'll do it. I didn't really mean for it to go this long before doing it, but here we are. I feel like I'm in the right headspace for it. At least I hope so. So, um, but it also has given me some more time to really think about it a little bit more. Because my first intention was to do the birth narrative for Christmas, and then maybe around um, Easter or something, do the resurrection and all that, and have it like a two part. But now I think I've decided to at least do three. So what I'm going to do there is do a. But this one is going to be part one, the birth narrative and everything wrapped around that. At the beginning, um, starting his story, and then I'm going to do a part two that's going to be more in the uh, I guess the ministry part, the middle part, middle section. And then I'll do a part three. Hopefully by then it'll be around around Easter, and I will do the resurrect, the crucifixion and resurrection, the whole ending story. So that's my plans. Um, and then from there I'll dive into. I plan to dive into like uh, the scriptures themselves, or the book itself, and how it relates into history and everything, like just breaking it down, the writings and stuff like that, authorships and things, all that kind of stuff. We're going to go into all that later. But so that's my plan. Hopefully that is cool with you, and we will uh and it'll be a good time, hopefully, and learn something along the way. So, thank you very much for joining me. If you would like the content and stuff that I've been doing, please consider liking, subscribe, like, share, comment, all the good stuff. And of course, as usual, check out my other channels over here. Um, the JMD Drummer, JMDPLAY. Check those out. Discord there. One-time donation QRs there, or above, of course. JMD Nation Patreon, $3 a month. Very much appreciated. Anything you do, any support you give is amazing, and I thank you very much. So, yeah, let's go. All right. So All right. First off, like I want to do in every one of these vehicles, I give my disclaimer, okay, that I grew up in the Christian sphere and in a Christian household. Doing the whole 9 yards. Sundays, Wednesdays, all that good stuff. Uh, and I was baptized around I think 10-ish, 11, somewhere around there. Um, Pretty much a very, for the most part, um, loyal, follower and practice of the religion. I come up Southern Baptist, so put that in that perspective. Southern Baptist here in the South of Mississippi. But about 25 is when I started my D. What do you call it? Uh, I walked away from religion. Just started programming myself. I guess you could say it's a really bad word. It's not the word I'm looking for, but uh, I did a lot of research, a lot of looking into Christianity origins and stuff, and the more I looked into it and deeper I got, the more I just ultimately couldn't accept it anymore. So eventually, I walked away, and so to speak, and I've went through all the frustrations. Like I said, that was when I was 25. I'm 42 now. So it's been several years. I've went through all the different mental like things with that, and struggles, anger, frustration, all your emotions and things. And of course, went through the periods where I just didn't care at all and didn't want to talk about it or didn't want to make a big deal about it. Um, uh, but over the past few years, I've gotten more and deeper into um, the studying of Christianity and the times back then, along with other mythologies and religions and stuff. I've been doing a whole lot of research and just learning about that. So, and it's really given me an appreciation for history, especially ancient history, and in the context even more so and heavily in Christian history. So, understanding where I, come, why the things that I believed and everything before previously, where it come from, and understanding, how it became such a huge emphasis in lives of people today. Uh, so that's my Discord, disclaimer, whatever. So, letting you understand where I'm coming from, and so there's no kind of hidden thing here or anything like that. Um, like I said, this is, and I'm not any kind of historian. I'm not kind of an archaeologist, uh, or haven't been to any kind of Bible schooling or anything like that. This is just me, what I've learned from other historians and professionals in the field, archaeologists and things like that. Just uh, in and kind of like taking all that in. Um, of course, I have my own personal views of the world and the and everything. That's outside of religion and Christianity in particular, anything like that. But just understanding from the inside that bubble, inside that scope, getting a better understanding of it for myself as well, to help others get a better understanding of it as well, and not even in the way of trying to just like pull anyone from it, or but just understand it better themselves, learn more about it themselves. Um, is more or less, or at least help uh, you know help you decide to really learn more about it yourself, whether it's through me or somewhere else. But anyways, that's my disclaimer. All that out of the way, let's get into Jesus, right? All right, so Um, as we know, your Jesus story is, as a whole, all comes from our four Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In this particular one, now there are references to him in other books outside of in his life outside of the Bible, but it's very limited, and only a few other like external gospels that were found um, since in the past 100 years or so, um, along with some mentions vaguely, I think for the most part, in a couple of other like writers of that time that were not particularly like in the that the Christian bubble. But anyways, um, but all that aside, we're going to we're here for the birth narrative. So and when we from where we get the birth narrative is from Matthew and Luke. And what I'm going to do, just like I've done on all the previous ones, I'm going to do it from the video will be broken into three parts. First, it will be the from the religious perspective, what you were taught in church, what you learn, how you learn it, things like that. And then I'm going to then move to like the more historic points, um, uh, splitting it up, breaking it up, understanding the narrative a little bit deeper, and from a more historical point of view, a more historian kind of uh, ancient time and all that kind of point of view. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about my personal like views of it, where I stand personally with it, and what I think personally of it. So to start off, all right, like I said, you get your birth narrative in Matthew and Luke. Um, what we understand, or what is usually taught in church, what I was taught in church and stuff like that, was this just grand, wonderful narrative, um, the nativity scene or whatnot. You oftentimes get your plays and stuff in church around the Christmas time, where you have, of course, Mary, Joseph, Jesus, baby Jesus, of course, and the angels, uh, your wise men, your shepherds, uh, you know, miscellaneous animals, sheep, whatnot, um, and of course the star, right? Um, and that they're born in, it's Mary's virgin. Jesus is born of a virgin. So uh, he was born in a manger because there was no room for in the inn, right? Born in Bethlehem. All these points like that. The wise men bring the, your three uh, gifts, right? And uh, it's just a wonderful, right, story, right? And you learn it that way, uh, as a whole, as if it's just this grand story that just happens, and uh, it's a unique story, um, to a degree, as we'll talk about. But it is, it comes, it's taught that it's a unique story that nobody's ever, you know had before. And like I said, it was the the angels come, told Mary, what was going to happen, told Joseph what was going to happen, and then it happens. Tell that his name's going to be Jesus. He's the Son of God, and all this kind, all these things, and he's going to be the Savior of the world. And it's a great story, and you learn about it. You throw yourself into it. You really don't question it. You're told not to question it, just like everything else. Um, uh, and it's, like I said, it's a great story. Uh, Play after play does on it every year. The whole grand thing. Um, But when you start really breaking it down and looking at the stories, looking at Matthew, looking at Luke, and really start looking at all the details, this is where we're going to blend into the second part, because I don't think there's really much to say about how you are taught in church. I mean, that's pretty much it. You're told that we all know the story, especially if you've been in Christianity or are a Christian yourself. You've been in church. You grow up with this. Um, and so, but when you start looking at Matthew, you start looking at Luke, and you start actually reading and separating them out and consider them in their own context, you know, by their own writers and what they're writing, what their intention is, the details that they give. Because what's happening here is that you're getting this grand story within your Christian bubble that is really a compilation of the two stories, because because the story in Matthew and the story in Luke are actually completely different, and they do not have the same details in them, outside of, he's born in Bethlehem, born of a virgin, um, and his name's to be Jesus, and the Savior, being the Savior. Outside of that, there's really no. All the other details are different, completely different, and so in some details are so different that they actually contradict each other. Okay, they don't add up at all. Um, so what you have when you start looking at Matthew, here's the story in Matthew. In Matthew, you have it starts off with them in Bethlehem. They live in Bethlehem. They're from Bethlehem, and you have uh, him born in Bethlehem. There is the wise men that have traveled from the east, and they have come, who knows how far. They come to, they first stop, they're following the star, okay, the star that's over Bethlehem, and they're following this star, and the star first leads them to King Herod, all right, and they question King Herod, asking, where is this, the Savior that's being born, basically, and, King Herod doesn't know. He doesn't really understand. Doesn't really, at all. Well, once they get to Herod, then the star moves and goes over, over where Jesus is, and that helps to lead the wise men to actual Jesus. Well, King Herod is known to be a pretty harsh leader in that time. He and for if you understand the Romans in any way, understanding that they there was good times and bad times within within the whole empire as far as leaders and whatnot, and different. Of course, understand that he is leader over just a certain part of the Roman Empire is massive, and he's just like a subset leader over the particular area, in in where Bethlehem, Jerusalem, what is known at that time to be the Judea and Samaria, Israel, and he's pretty rough, and so and anytime he's the king, and you don't, for there to be something told to him that he has there's somebody else is being claimed to be the king of the Jews, as being the king of King of Kings or whatever, is going to rule over his people. That's that comes about as a threat. I mean, that threatens Herod. So to a degree, so what happens is once Jesus is born, okay, the wise men come. It's probably um roughly around 2 years, okay, because what you wind up having when Herod finds out that Jesus has been born, and the wise men have come all this way and they're visiting him. What he tells the wise men to do is to go find him and then report back to him about where his location is. But the wise men instead do not go back. They just, when they do leave, they just leave and go back where they come from. So they don't actually tell Herod. Well, then Herod gets upset, mad that he doesn't know where this Jesus character is. So um, he puts out this, you know, uh, uh, command to kill the firstborn children um, in the kingdom, in that area particularly, um, and he's basically targeting any child 2 years and under. So that gives us the idea that this is at least, or the thought that Jesus has potentially been up to 2 years. So, because if for Herod to think that Jesus would be around the year, around two, if that's what he's targeting, 2 and under, that's the idea, is that Jesus could be probably around two by this time. So what Joseph and Mary do is they flee to Egypt to escape Herod's wrath and, happening. Now, understand that Egypt is not exactly close, okay? It would take a long trip to go to back to Egypt, to go to Egypt. And so you have that in itself is a little bit of a weird situation, or kind of a complex thing for a mother with a relatively newborn child traveling such a distance. It would take weeks to get there for one. And they're in Egypt for quite a while, for quite a few years. And after the whole thing happens and it goes down there and they feel that they are safe, then they decide to come back. All right. And they were going to attempt to go back to Bethlehem, but then they find out that Herod's son is in charge now, and he is even worse than his father. So instead of going back to Bethlehem, that's where they decide to go to Nazareth and hunker down in Nazareth, to protect, Jesus from any wrath of King Herod's son. So that's the gist of that. So you have this going back and forth. It's a long period of time that they're in Egypt, like several years potentially that they're in. I want to say, if I'm not mistaken, up to like 6 years maybe that they could have been in Egypt. It was a good long while. Before coming back and settling back in Nazareth. So, or at least 3, I think. I can't remember exactly how many years, but it's a good long while. Okay. So that's the narrative in Matthew. The everything that Matthew focuses on is trying to fulfill prophecies and stuff that were in the Old Testament. That's what his center is around, is focusing on fulfilling prophecies in the Old Testament and fulfilling Jewish prophecies, that a Savior would come and like the being born of a virgin, being born in Bethlehem, all these different things. That's what he's basically concentrating on. Now, in Luke's narrative, it's completely different. What you have in Luke's narrative is that they actually live in Nazareth. They don't start in Bethlehem like Matthew. They live in Nazareth. They're from Nazareth. And they're the way he gets Jesus to Bethlehem is that there's a census supposedly that is being made, and it says the census is across the whole world. Okay. Clearly, people have realized that more or less probably means the world that he knows, which is the Roman kingdom. Whoever wrote Luke is the Roman kingdom. So he just basically saying that there was a census across the entire kingdom. And that census was pushing Joseph to go back to Bethlehem, because the census idea was that they were to go back to the uh, their census was taking them back 1,000 years, which would have taken, and Luke gives the genealogy of Joseph and stuff, which takes them back to David. And or that 1,000 years takes him back to David. So the idea is that he's doing a census and he's got to go back to the origin location of David 1,000 years ago. So that gets him to Bethlehem. So that already in itself gives us a problem, because for starters, if you think about it, you got this region-wide census going on, and if the argument is for the census to, you have to go back to the origin of an ancestor that lived 1,000 years before you, that doesn't really make much sense. It would be it would be so many. For one, you don't, how many of us know. I mean, you think about even yourself. How many of you know, ancestor that you have, going back even a few generations, much less 10, 12 generations, or more. For starters, them even knowing what their line would be and how far it would go back, and furthermore, knowing where the location they were in, and then on top of that, that would mean that everybody would be traveling and going all over the place just to try to do a census. Doesn't really make any sense whatsoever. But like I said, that gets them to Bethlehem. So there's a census, gets them to Bethlehem. Joseph takes Mary with him. He doesn't necessarily even have to. Like, the idea that he would have to take Mary with him doesn't really add up, because she wouldn't be involved in that. But let's just say that, okay, she's pregnant, though. So he takes her with him. She has the baby in Bethlehem. And basically, from there, they do, in Luke, you have no wise men. You do not have a star. Instead, you have shepherds. So shepherds come visit the baby, and you wind up having you have wind up in those times you had rituals after having a child. Okay, you had to wait up to like I want to say it's like 42 days or something like that, something like somewhere roughly like that, of like of cleanliness. It's like a period of cleanliness after you've had a baby, and that you're restricted. You can't really go anywhere. As far as the mother's concerned, you can't really go anywhere. And then once that period is over, you are then considered clean. And then so you go to the temple, and there's like this cleaning ritual that happens to fulfill and finish the cleaning process. And then that's where, and from there, so that's what happens. So you have basically them in Bethlehem for that amount of time. And then from there, they leave for Bethlehem and go um, back to Nazareth. They don't go to Egypt. There's no trip to Egypt or anything. Um, that brings them back to Nazareth within within I mean at best 2 months time. So he's still a newborn getting back to Nazareth, but in Matthew's version, he's several years old before they get back to Nazareth and settle in Nazareth. So there's a major difference there altogether. Um, uh, and so that's already a problem just in itself. Why in the world would they decide to create uh, narratives and both of them be so different and not have any when either one of them are going to any kind of details, they are not the same details whatsoever. The times don't add up. The ages of Jesus in certain places don't add up. So it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But what you have, what happens is that Christians are like, well, we can argue that maybe they just didn't put, one just decided not to put it in there or whatever, but they're basically just telling the same story. We just put it together and make it one big story because that's what it is, and blah blah blah. But there's a lot of problems with that. There's a lot of just accepting things and assuming things that don't add up and don't go with what they said whatsoever. And on top of that, in one of the narratives, the angel goes to Joseph, and in the other narrative, the angel goes to Mary. When because in Matthew, Joseph is actually going to leave Mary. Joseph's an old man for starters. And he was going to divorce Mary, but this angel came to Joseph and persuaded him, and told him what was happening. And persuaded him to stay, basically. Because she was going to have a son, and he was going to be the Son of God. And his name was going to be Jesus. And so he was to be the earth-bearing father, to protect them and whatnot. But in Luke, Gabriel came to Mary and told her about her having the babe. So there's a difference. There's a lot of difference. And that's fine that that's the case. You have two separate different people creating a narrative trying to explain how Jesus was born. Okay. The fact that they're different isn't really, it is a problem, certainly, but it also shows that they clearly did not know each other. Especially if you take that as sincere that they both wrote them, they didn't know each other. And when we look and what we know of the synoptic Gospels to begin with, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is understood, it is thought to be most historians and most academics consider Mark to be first, because and Mark in priority, basically, and then usually it's Matthew and Luke kind of. Some people just think one or the other, but most I think majority think Matthew came next and then Luke, or they relatively may have been done about the same time, but more or less Matthew was probably before Luke, and then John came later. Now there's some people that think John was actually first, but John there's each one of them have a different objective, and they're telling the story for a different reason. And that's very clear. Mark is telling, he tells the story of Jesus, doesn't even have a birth narrative for starters. He starts with the baptism, basically, and doesn't have, like I said, doesn't have a birth narrative. And his whole idea is that Jesus is this weird figure that nobody can understand. Nobody actually gets him. Even his disciples and followers, nobody truly understands him. He's a mysterious figure, and just nobody truly understands it and gets it. Where Matthew, of course, has a birth narrative. His whole objective is from a more Jewish standpoint. He's concentrated. He's actually considered or thought to be Jewish to some degree, although some parts of his book, his writings, some in some way kind of argue against that. But for the most part, he comes off as Jewish in nature, trying to fulfill Jewish prophecies from the Old Testament. That's like I said, that's his whole idea in the entirety of Jesus' life. That's the idea, is that he has come to fulfill prophecies, point blank. Luke comes from a more of a Gentile point of view, and trying to basically say that, that Jesus didn't come just for Jews. He was also for Gentiles to some degree. He plays that whole thing. He's trying to make a point for that. He's not really that concerned with prophecy fulfills or anything like that. It's just that, Jesus came. He was the Son of God, and he's for everybody. John, on the other hand, John is the one that comes with this full-on, like, Jesus is the Son of God. He's like divine from the get-go. So your three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they really concentrate to the most part around Jesus becoming divine. Well, Mark concentrates on Jesus coming divine at baptism. Luke also does this, but then at the same time, he has a birth narrative too that kind of plays into this idea of him becoming divine at birth because of the virgin birth. Matthew does that same thing. Matthew doesn't concentrate so much. His baptism version is a little different. John, on the other hand, emphasizes that Jesus was from the beginning. He was divine. He is a heavenly being. He is God. Like, he was in the beginning. He was always divine from the get-go. That's how, it's not before, not at birth, not at, way on divine. Well, actually, let me back up. Well, let me correct myself. Mark actually is there. I'm not even sure Mark has a. Mark's idea is that he becomes divine. Well, yeah, I guess it is from baptism. So that's the idea. Okay, the general idea on that, as far as the books and how they're different. They're coming at it from a different perspective, but often, like I said, what you have going on in Christian circles is everybody putting all that together and trying to make a grand scheme, like they're all written to be as a one story. One grand story that's, being written and influenced by God. So, but when you break them down in each one of them, there's a lot of differences. There's there's a lot of contradictions too in the stories, not agreeing with each other. It's sometimes not even agreeing with themselves in parts. which we will go deeper in later. But that's the idea. Now, one other issue with Luke is that, and this is going to get to my final point for this particular video, is that there is oftentimes when you look at the first two chapters of Luke are the ones that concentrate on his birth. Chapter 2 concentrates on Jesus' birth. Chapter 1 concentrates on John the Baptist's birth. And so what you have is this kind of dualism going on with John the Baptist and Jesus in the beginning. But then when you get into chapter 3, which actually starts with John the baptism scene, and John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, there's many scholars and historians and stuff that have looked at this and have determined that it's most likely, and it looks to be, that chapter 3, it starts as if it is the beginning of a book. And the writing style of the first two chapters, is different from the writing style of the rest of the book from chapter 3 on. So the argument from a lot of academics is that Luke originally started on chapter 3, that there was not a birth narrative to begin with. And that was added later. It's thought that the whole first two chapters were added at a later time, potentially by a completely different author, a scribe possibly, or something like that. Which then brings in a whole different perspective and a whole different thought. You know, if Luke never originally had the first two, then that means that, and Luke seemed to concentrate in on the birth, on the baptism as well. Like I said before, he was very strong at, like, Jesus became divine at the baptism. But then you have this weird birth narrative that comes into chapter 2, trying to tie with John the Baptist from chapter 1, and their birth narratives being very similar in nature, but the birth narrative of Jesus is completely contradictory and different from the birth narrative of Matthew. Stories are completely different, even though there's, the kind of base crux is there that, like I said, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. He was born of a virgin, Savior of the world. Like, that's, those are concrete, but everything else is different. And my point in going there, like I said, is that I don't think the birth narrative was original to Luke. I think it was written way later as sort of trying to create this complementary type of thing, maybe even to Matthew, but also trying to identify the connection of John the Baptist with Jesus. And we will go further on in the next video, like starting from basically the baptism. We'll talk about the baptism, and that's something else I've considered also, is talking about the baptism separate from even his teachings. But I might put that all together, might not. But so we'll see. I don't know. It might wind up being a 4-part. But I personally, now I'm getting to what I personally think. I personally think that both narratives were completely made up. Matthew was writing with an agenda that for him to fulfill prophecies. And the only way for him to do that, and one of the major prophecies, was that the Savior was going to come out of Bethlehem. So he has Jesus or Mary and Joseph from Bethlehem, Jesus born from there, and then they wind up in Nazareth. Now, one could argue that maybe that is the original and that's it, and that is the true narrative. But I actually think that both of them were made up. Um, I don't think there was originally a birth narrative period. I don't think anybody really knew how or why Jesus was born at first. I don't think anybody knew. Because Jesus kind of comes out of nowhere. He's from, he's basically a nobody. I mean, you get that from Mark. He's mysterious. He's unknown. People don't really know who he is, where he come from. He just come out of nowhere. Um, his ministry basically starting when he gets baptized from John the Baptist. He learns from John the Baptist. Like he gets most of his teachings and his uh, uh, apocalyptic views from John the Baptist. So basically, he's a student of John the Baptist that continues on into a ministry until his crucifixion. That's what Jesus really, the history, this historical person, that's the idea. And I actually think that's probably, for the most part, accurate to the true historical Jesus. But I don't think there was a narrative. I don't think he come from, if he did come from Nazareth, and which is thought to be, like he's originally from Nazareth. I don't think he was born in Bethlehem. I think he was originally born in Nazareth. If he come from there, then Nazareth is like a very small place. It's not. It's like a it's very insignificant. Matter of fact, most other writings in the time never even describe a place called Nazareth. There's even a question of whether Nazareth even existed. But it is thought for the most part that it probably did. But if he came from there, that he was a nobody, very unknown, but then suddenly he just breaks out into the scene as an apocalyptic preacher, which there were several apocalyptic preachers around the area. That was the time in the Hellenistic, the Hellenistic age was full of apocalypticism. A lot of people were speaking in that way, especially from the Jewish perspective, because that was just that's what they had kind of fell into. They didn't start out that way, but they kind of had fell into that. And so he basically come out of nowhere. And that's the reason why I don't think, personally, that anybody really knew what or where he come from, how he was born, any kind of details of that. I think it just was created for a purpose, to create a connection of him being the Son of God, which became a core part of the narrative after he died. Going in through, as the Christian groups and stuff grew and were gaining influence. I think that was what happened. So honestly, originally, like I said, for as far as the birth narrative, I don't think it really happened. I think we were both completely made up. Now, that's not saying that Jesus isn't real. I actually personally do think that there was more than likely a historical Jesus. Okay. All the details of him, questionable. But I think he did exist. Not sure where it came from. Not sure, why or how he got into his, teaching and, other outside of just trying to fulfill, or not really fulfill, but try to bring back kind of a or maybe even try to change the Jewish idea. And also he being a little bit of an anarchist in a way, fighting back against the Roman Empire. I think there was a degree of that happening too, because of the apocalypticism of him teaching, or him. I think he truly thought that there was something going to happen to usher in for the freedom of Jerusalem or the Jews rather, from the Roman Empire. And God was going to take over. God was going to send. I think he did think about and believed there was going to be a Son of God, some kind of being that God was going to send down, but he didn't think he was going to be it. He did not think he was it. And we'll get deeper into that into the other videos. But anyway, this video has been long enough. But we're concentrating solely on the narrative here, the birth narrative. So that's what I think. Also, what's interesting, a point that I've found somewhere before, is the idea even of the virgin birth. I mean, all of the characteristics of the birth narrative are not really unique. There were birth narratives with virgin births in quite a few legend stories from that time and before. Jesus was not the first by any means. And, but the idea that he was fulfilling a prophecy of the virgin being born of a virgin actually come, like I said, from the Old Testament. I'm probably going to get this wrong. I think it's in Isaiah. I'm not completely sure though. I can't remember exactly. But even where it references a so-called virgin, that a savior is going to be born of a virgin, the original wording there doesn't necessarily, or doesn't really even translate to a virgin. It just translates to a young lady, or in general. It's not really speaking, or not, a terminology does not really translate to being a virgin, for starters. The other issue is also that even in the old Arabic language or Hebrew language, virginity, or the idea of a virginity, doesn't necessarily, my understanding or a possible understanding, is that it is confusing. It's not necessarily that it's from a woman who has not had sex, basically. Not someone who has been the idea is that it was from it, that it very much possibly just meant a woman who has not given birth. So the idea is that her womb opening is not that her womb's being opened from the outside, but she's being opened from the inside. So the idea of virgin in ancient time could have potentially just meant that she had not given birth to a child, which, when you really think about it, makes way more sense. Even in the birth narrative, makes way more sense. That Mary just didn't, although I'm not saying that that's the way they wrote it, but it would make more sense that way. That she was born of a virgin, meaning that she had not given a birth. He was her first child, basically. And that was all that meant. Makes more sense to me. I'm not saying that that's the purpose in writing it that way, or whoever wrote Matthew wrote it. That wasn't their purpose, but it would make more sense that way than in our more modern thought process of virginity, meaning, the other way around. So that's interesting for me, and like I said, there's no way to completely know, because translations don't really go one for one oftentimes. There's nuance, and you're really just sort of taking a guess at times on certain words as to and how they would translate, because we're translating from Hebrew or Aramaic to the Greek, which is what we pretty much, most of our Bibles come from Latin, but they were translated from Latin from Greek. So and that's the other idea, is that of who wrote, which we'll get into later when we start talking about the text and stuff like that and authorship, is who actually wrote the, Gospels and all these other things. That's going to be interesting. But yeah, so to clear this all back up, I don't believe the narratives happened. I don't believe we really know how the historical Jesus was born. I think they were completely created for a reason to, to push a narrative of him being the Son of God. And they had to find some way of doing it. And also, to some degree, fulfilling prophecies, and just having this, unique story, or try to have a unique story. But that's what I feel. That's pretty much it. I hope this was not too crazy of a video. I know it's long, but I hope that it was. And I may have some details a little bit wrong. I apologize if I do. If there's ways if you think I've got something wrong and you want to correct me, or make a clarification on it. Maybe I'm not necessarily wrong, but I just had something a slight bit off, or whatever from your understanding. Let me know in the comments. That's fine. I mean, the idea here is to give our what we learn, or what we know, what we have learned, or I'm giving what I have learned, and then you can give me back what maybe you have learned, if you've learned something different, or if you've learned something the same. Maybe we can, connect on that, or we can, share in that and discuss it. Because honestly, a lot of the details cannot be completely known. I mean, they are wishy-washy at best. Because I mean, ultimately, all of this was written by men who clearly had opinions and agendas to write about, whether good or bad, which is really, to some degree, arguable on which one it is. But anyways, thank you very much for joining me. If you've gotten this far, you are freaking awesome. Hell, comment that I don't even know what to comment. If you've got if you got this far, comment I'm still here. I don't know. Whatever. Anyways, thank you very much for joining me, and hopefully I'll get the next one out a lot faster. And like I said, and I haven't, like I said, I haven't completely decided yet on how I'm going to split the middle, whether I just solely focus on the baptism area or the whole thing. But it's either going to be, like I said, it's either going to ultimately be 3 or 4 parts. But thank you very much for joining me, and until next time, peace. It's been Clear Talk. Later.